Welcome to Spiritual Studies Session 60. This session will be focusing on the Dogon. What you could expect from this session is a mentioning of the geographical history of the area, the notable characteristics culturally of these people, going on to their creation story or the kind of mixed bag creation story that's given, and then touching on the more sensational claims that have been put onto the Dogon via ancient astronaut theorists. So this is going to acquaint the listener, whoever, with this information. And if you are just getting to this channel, the focus is always on comparative religion. We are going forward with this material with a few caveats. Caveat number one is something that I want to distinguish for future folk sessions and folk religions and animistic traditions. That is the difference between a religion loci and an import religion. A religion loci is going to focus on a people's inherited religion story, and they don't go around knocking on doors. They don't proselytize. It is to the area where the people dwell, and it explains all the things that they do. Everything that they do in the mundane life is according or following along with the religion loci. Whereas import religions are just that, imported. They are not genuine to the land, they are not genuine to the people per se, and I know that's a bit convoluted to say, but you can divorce oneself from the way you live with your religion via imported religions, and that's also a really rough thing to say. I say this mostly, so don't get me wrong here, I say this mostly because when approaching information on the Dogon, we are not initiates to the beliefs, the lifestyle, and the natural means by which you acquire information about the Dogon beliefs. There are initiations by the people, for the people, toward initiation and understanding. So what information I can share from henceforth is through ethnographic and anthropological research, mostly. I have managed to get some more primary accounts, but that should be hedged straight away. So let's hop into it, because there's a lot of very interesting material when it comes to these particular people. This area south of where the Sahara ends and begins this newer but still dry area, there have been people occupying the surrounding plateau for thousands of years. This is in Mali. The earliest claimed or known inhabitants were the Toloi. Later on, the Telem were there, and again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing these correctly, and they created or carved out these dwellings in the high cliffs, these occupying caves. The Dogon arrived later, and they were described with a word that means the ones we found. In addition, the Dogon were described by a Fulani word meaning the strangers or stranger. There is a debate about where the Dogon originate. Certain scholars will suggest that the Dogon come as delineations or descendant from Egyptians. However, as we'll see when going through what we know of the folk tradition, this is not a real good claim. But, as claimed before, the Dogon traveled by way of southwest Mali. There have been several attempts on the Dogon people to make them Islamified. There has been several attempts of Islamification, of which still continues to this day. Islam in the area represents a more modern, that is your access to the modern world, whereas the lands of which the Dogon inhabit is far from modern world or paved road in a certain regard. So many times people have come in and done trouble, right? Like made trouble for them. Not just jihadists, but also the slave raids. And this was also done to the Bobo, to the Gurma, to the Yoruba. So over and over, the Dogon have withstood throughout time, not just in their beliefs, but also where they are. And they started to settle those caves that were made in the side of mountains to better escape persecution by others and to get better defense. So they have moved in not so recent or not so ancient history. They are considered one of the last people in West Africa to still foster the old traditional way of life, unmarred by modern civilization. So, in which case, we find these rituals that are still practiced. We find masks, we find complex initiations, and we find the living word, the living tradition. And so, like I mentioned before, a lot of what is known is by virtue of a French ethnologist, of which published plenty of information. The Dogon have come into attention by virtue of a ritual that they perform that we'll be going into later, and there is a notable market for purchasing their masks. Approximately 800,000 Dogon live in the remote area of the South Sahara. They do not speak one language. There are at least 20 distinct Dogon languages, which by itself is very curious. The funeral ceremony mentioned is the Dhamma. The Dhamma is what most people recognize, those who know of the Dogon. It is a series of dances of which the practitioners, the participants, mimic people, animals, spirits. They're even at times mimicking outsiders, making them out to be very strange and humorous, because you have to imagine how strange people would look to you if you were a Dogon. And the Dhamma for outsiders is a tourist event. People seek out seeing this. The Dogon are very tolerant of other beliefs. They do not push back, so to speak. You know, they aren't, like I mentioned, they are a religion loci. They are not proselytizers. They are not aggressive towards other beliefs. There have been efforts towards Christianization. However, it's been very insubstantial. But like mentioned before, there has been more way given to Islamification within the Dogon communities. In regards to initiations, all boys within must undergo the first initiation, which is circumcision, which, as I understand it and as I've read into it, is a marker into adulthood. And if it was in the older days, then after the circumcision, these newfound adults would be sent out to survive and have themselves what is called a vision quest, a walkabout, which we see this with the Aboriginals, and we see this also across Africa. However, as mentioned, this is no longer done, or at least isn't as readily observed. The next stage of initiation is optional, and that is to participate in the Dhamma, or the world of masks, and to learn how to sacrifice for the ancestors and how to dance with the masks. Now, again, religion loci, animistic cultures, generally speaking, every part of the ceremony means something. And you must know why every part of the ceremony means something, because that's what imbibes it with ever more meaning. Otherwise, position in society would be to know what plants to not harvest, what animals to not hunt, and what water sources ought to be protected. There is also a series of specialized individuals who climb the cliffs. Farmers occupy the higher end of the caste system and are on the inside of the village, whereas blacksmiths, craftsmen, wood carvers are of lower castes to the society and are on the outside. And if you think about it, the peripheral, right? If you think about a city, who lives in the middle of the city? Well, those are the big boys, right? Those are the boys that can afford living in the, the skyscrapers and the upper complexes, right? And then who's on the outside? Well, those are the lower caste. So we can see a good telling analogy here. Interestingly enough, a man and a woman within the culture are not considered married until they have their first child. There are a number of different versions of the creation myth, of the cosmogony. However, we're going to be mushing them all together. We're going to be throwing everything that I could find out there to get as broad of a stroke as we can understand. So with that, we can start jumping more specifically into the spiritual elements, or the spiritual culture, more like. So those who have completed initiation are called the Seri, S-E-R-I. And if they reach this old age and this old initiation, they will be given the secret ritual language that is Sigiso. S-I-G-I-S-O is how it's spelled. This is apparently a language that is understood by all creatures, a cosmic language. The Seri are a sort of council that gather around the Hogon, H-O-G-O-N. The Hogon is the spiritual leader. Sometimes is the oldest person in the village, and sometimes is just simply the one that's highest initiated, that the one who knows the most of what has been inherited. Sometimes there are deviations here. Though he is the keeper of this knowledge, again, there are series around of which participate in discussing issues in regards to the village and decisions. It is not an authoritarian role. Initiations through time have become shorter and shorter and shorter, and those who reach this state of becoming a Seri the population is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. So there is a reasonable worry that Sigiso, this language, is going to slowly disappear. This esoteric knowledge of the Dogon disappearing as things like Islam are replacing the animism of the people. Villages are believed to be shared by both the living and the dead. They coexist in a union with each other. One does not exist without the other, and as we'll find when diving into the spirituality, there is a high preoccupation with the nature of duality. Everything has its twin. So accordingly, there is the living village, and there is those who are dead for the village, right? And they both are simultaneous. The sky god, Amma, is responsible for maintaining the balance between the living and the dead. Another deity is the trickster, which is Ogo, or what could be analogous to the evil deity, which we'll be getting into. And the third supernatural entity, deity, is the Nommo, which is sometimes many or just one, depending, and of which we'll be talking plenty about later. So, in regards to rituals, when you have been going through the first initiation and you're reaching the second initiation of being in the society of masks, joining the awa, you will hold the Dhamma ceremony, and many things will be prepared for a long time, making the masks, making the regalia, preparing the grounds, rehearsing routines. This Dhamma is done to release the dead. So when someone dies, there is the first funeral, that is the immediate funeral for that individual. Then there is the second funeral, which is this ceremony, the Dhamma, which sends them all, guides them, or chases them into the other realm, into the other world. Now, and then lastly, there's a third ceremony, which we'll talk about in a bit. But this is where I want to do a comparative religion observation here. When we look at animistic cultures across the world, we see, no matter what time period, that there is this preoccupation with the fact that the dead need some help moving on to the next world. We saw this with the Aboriginals. And curiously enough, you saw this in a more extreme case in the Egyptians. The Egyptians with their practice of mummification, or with the Greeks and putting coins on the eyes of the dead. This idea that they need help somehow, or they will become lost. And in this specific belief, in the Dogon, the belief is that they will wander. They will wander around, and they need help to be sent on. And that is what the Dhamma is for. The dead pose a threat to the living. What could happen when you get all wily, you know? So, in this ceremony, as mentioned, they're depicting people, they're depicting gods, they're depicting spirits. So, in that, there are certain animal attributes that also get represented, most notably the fox, which plays the part of this trickster deity mentioned before. So, the last ceremony, so again, the first funeral for the individual, the second funeral for everybody to move on, the Dhamma, and then the Sigui, which I don't know if I'm saying that right, Sigui. And this is something that's only done every 65 years. So it's once in a generation, and it represents the funeral, so to speak, of one generation to the next generation. So it's an even greater collective funeral. So you see there's a 3 going on here. The individual, the greater, and then the greater, which we'll see this again in their creation story. So to see somebody being let go, right, to be pushed, your family member has died and you have done the Dhamma, and you are ecstatic to see that they have finally moved on to the realm of the ancestors. This is something to celebrate, and this is why they go through such tremendous effort to do so, and why they have always went through the effort to do so. Okay, so let's talk about the creation story and get into more of the nitty-gritty. So as mentioned, Amma is the force, the principal deity of creation. This is a hermaphroditic deity. It is beyond all. It is beyond. So, this word, Amma, could share a root with the Egyptian and Semitic Amen. Amma, Amen. Amen meaning to make firm, to fortify, to give something foundation, to establish. Amma, that which was at the beginning. Now here, listen to this. Both Amma and his twin, Ogo, are known to have existed inside of a cosmic egg. This is the Orphic egg that we've seen countless times in the Finnish, in Orphism, on and on and on. The egg at the beginning of time, except there is a distinction here. The Dogon also referred to it as an accelerated ball, the womb of all world signs, containing all the seeds and archetypes of existence. Amma begins to speak. Speak causes a vibration, speaks 7 words into the seed called a po, which, if I recall correctly, po is the word for the smallest possible seed known, which is indicative of, say, what? A black hole? An atom? With these 7 words spoken inside of the egg, or to the egg, right? Through the egg, created a spiraling, an accelerated ball, and broke the membrane of it on its 8th turn. And it scattered all the primordial matter across the universe. So imagine the spinning, right? And then it just spills. And that's what gives it this tendril look. That's what gives it this spiral look, is how the egg broke. Isn't that fascinating? So you can already see how very sophisticated, astronomically, this is. These tendrils, these spirals out from this point, are known as the clavicles of Amma. The shapes, like, right, the clavicles, the collarbone of Amma. This is what we call the arms of the Milky Way galaxy. And it is believed that the navel of this whole thing, where it was, happened, what they call Amma's navel, Amma Bolo Boitolo, is the spiral nebula of Orion, the birthplace of stars, as it's put. Briefly mentioned, Amma splits into 2 because, again, everything has its twin over and over again here. So if Amma is foundation, Amen is foundation, what is Ogo? Ogo is opposite. Ogo is disorder, disharmony, the trickster. So with the creation, you have order and disorder. Disorder somehow entered into the metaphysical nature of the early universe. And this is also antithetical to what we've said many times in studying the New Age, in the quantum physics of observing whether they are waves or particles. How everything has these 2 states, the twins, the order and the disorder. So, in the beginning of time, Amma also created the earth. And this is another story. Again, I told you, I'm telling you all these things mushed together. So if it seems confusing, I'm just giving the lay of the land. It's very hard to put this together because, again, we are outsiders. We are not born of the tradition. So, creates the earth and is immediately joined with it. These stars are representative of the various body parts of Amma. Again, the seat of heaven, Amma's navel. They're named places that all are Amma. Amma created the stars by throwing pellets of the earth into space, and created the sun by modeling two bowls, one made of red copper, which becomes the sun, and one of white copper, which becomes the moon. The solar system Sirius is going to come under a lot of attention later in this talk. Sigitolo and Potolo. And this is where Ogo broke free from the cosmic egg. Okay, so Orion was where it shattered and spilled out, but Ogo split from the egg where Sirius is, the constellation Sirius. Broke free from the egg and disrupted the plans of harmony for the universe. So again, this is a metaphysical introduction of disorder to the universe that entered into Sirius. Interesting. A volatile aspect. And so this aspect is reacted to by Ogo in attempt to quell it, creates the Nommo, or the Nommo, I'm not sure, Nommo, Nommo. And they are water. They are water spirits, although they'll have many other characteristics as well. But here's the thing. There are many myths, as we've seen throughout the course, that begin the early universe with discussion of water. The waters on the face of the deep, the Nun, the Abzu, that it all came from the primordial waters. And so subsequently, we often see this progenitor creature, being, deity, that is indicative of a snake. You know, the Hydra, the Leviathan, the Tiamat. So this volatile aspect of the early universe being represented perhaps by a snake. And this idea of calling it Hydra, right? The process perhaps of the early universe creating hydrogen. So a victory for order in the early cosmos over chaos and volatility, that since order became victorious over the serpent disorder, Hydra, out of its body came harmony, right? I believe God in the Bible makes the earth, or surrounds the earth, or protects the earth with the body of the snake. But we're going to have to touch back on that later. In mentioning the Nommo, they are part fish, part reptilian, part human, part non-physical. So this is where we have the ancient aliens, ancient astronaut theorists jumping in about, because if asked about where this knowledge of astronomy is coming from, the Dogon say that the Nommo told them. But we'll get to that. So this Ogo, having this transgressive behavior, left from the solar system of Sirius, descended to Earth, and in this version created the sun. And realized that the solar system was unbalanced. So this is a different story that says that the early solar system was not complete, that it was created by disorder, or the demiurge, or the trickster deity. And he goes back to Sirius and pleads with Amma to get his female counterpart, which this counterpart is hidden inside of the imperceptible star that is Emayatolo, or what we would translate as Sirius C, which is yet to be discovered. So instead, Amma gives a Nommo, one of these angelic deities, over to be sacrificed to Ogo to create harmony in the solar system that we now call ours. So this can also be representative of these two aspects bringing together what we now recognize as order, the seen and the unseen. That something about what Sirius provided this solar system made it able to function by both seen and unseen forces. So between what? Magnetism, spiritual effects, unforeseen extrasensual energies, or gravity, also something unseen, and then the seen, making it possible. So the twins, Ogo couldn't do it without the twin. You see, I'm hoping this is starting to scratch the surface in the way that I intend to. Ogo was sent back to Earth upon the completion and was turned into, or transformed into, a pale fox that roams the material realm. So there's the fox as the trickster deity that takes form, physical form, on this world. So in this way, too, where do humans come from? Well, humans are delineations from the Nommo. The Nommo were originally created in this story as 4 different couples, like twins. 4 different sets of twins. And these are the progenitors of mankind. Initially having the appearance of a man and a snake. So these Nommo have this reptilian aspect, right? Which that's what the ancient astronauts play on a lot. The Draconians, these reptilian extraterrestrials, right? Smooth green body, eyes red, torso the same as humans, the rest of their body resemblant of snakes, forked tongues, webbed hands. Amphibious. They are depicted as amphibious. So that's what I want to get across, allegorically speaking. Amphibious. Allegorically speaking, they're amphibious. So they represent 2 different orders in one. And again, I mentioned before, they are also said to have a non-physical body. So these deities are indicative of all forms, is what I'm saying. They can live in water, they can live on earth. They can be seen, they can be unseen. They are indicative of the very twin nature. They're literally twins. So as opposed, I'm going to be giving an interpretation overall to interpret these myths as not physically extraterrestrial, but interpreting them just for context, or just as an experiment of thought, as allegorical, as we said it in the greater context of comparative religion. Okay. These 8 ancestors descended to the earth via a copper chain from the sky. Now, we see this in native traditions as well. I believe there was a story that was antithetical for the Pleiades, and the Pleiades coming down from the sky via a chain. This is found in the Americas as well, is my point. So how? How old are these stories? They initially, before the chain, they traveled on an ark that floated down to the earth. They descended from the sky in a vessel, in another telling, that is accompanied by fire and thunder. Now, when this happens, it creates a reservoir of water, and they dive into the water because, again, they're amphibious, right? So something comes down, crashes into the earth that is accompanied by fire and thunder. Okay, so the Nommo, straight from the gates, were said to be water spirits, right? So in which case, if we think about storms, what happens? What happens? Well, there's thunder. Water's falling from the sky, coming from the sky. Okay. Oh, and fire. That's strange. Oh, well, lightning. Lightning makes fire. How strange. Just an interpretation. Just an interpretation. Because it's literally said, the Nommo required a watery environment in which to live. They had drunk, the people had drunk of the body of the Nommo. The Nommo also made men drink. He gave all his life and principles to human beings. So, when we saw the vision serpent, when we saw the rainbow serpent, specifically, more specifically, the rainbow serpent, it was literally water. It is the serpentine shape of rivers. It is the serpentine shape of the nature of the shapes of water on the earth. Water as the descendant of man, is the ancestors of man. I'm just throwing stuff out there, okay? Because the name Nommo means to make one drink. Or it also has come to mean the watchers, the teachers, the masters of water. So maybe instead of simply just the physical beingness of water, it is the innate spirit of water. Because this aspect of this water being so significant is not unique. If you trace back the pneuma of the Greek, breath and spirit, trace it back to nu and ma, to the Egyptians, nu ma, nu, primordial water, the noon, ma, measure, to measure the primordial water, pneuma. You are, to say that you are a spirit, as is translated in the Bible, whenever the word spirit happens, it is pneuma, a measure of the water. And which I've said before in the course, an etymology of soul is water, seul, or of the lake. You also saw this in the Abzu of Sumeria. You see in the noon of the Egyptian polytheism. This is not unique. In Sumeria, they were the Oannes, the Oans. So what makes the ancient astronaut theorists extra on about it is they say within Dogon legend that the Nommo will return and visit the earth in human form. And maybe not just the Omo, maybe it's a mention of Amma, because Amma is also said to have stepped back from creation, right? Because all this is happening in the meantime. So anyway, let's go over some other details, and I don't want to over confuse things, but this is all so fascinating. So another version, Amma takes a lump of clay in the early universe, squeezes it in his hand, and then it flings it. And when he flings it, it forms. It forms the north, which is the top, and it forms the south, which is the bottom, which becomes the world. This original world was a female body, so we're seeing primordial goddess vibes here. And there is an intercourse between the original Nommo and the earth. So between water and earth, which creates fibers, which creates spirals from the sun, vehicles for moisture, tornadoes, and wind. So the mating between the earth and water made it what it is. However, we still have the trickster of the fox, Ogo, and Ogo impresses himself upon the mother, impresses himself upon the earth, and has intercourse with it. And this results in disorder. This results in what they have coined, like menstrual blood, which is viewed as, this representation of death, which we initially were not going to die as humans. We were not set to die. We were delineations of the Nommo. So our mortality is because of this abominable act by the trickster deity. There's this interesting case where it's said that fire was stolen from the first Nommo. So again, this goes back to a few things. One, fire is stolen from the gods. We've seen this throughout the world in different traditions. Prometheus, right? So where does fire maybe first come from? It comes from the heavens, comes from lightning, right? So it comes from the heavens, it comes from the gods, it comes from the water spirits, it comes from the Nommo, the water spirits. So the fire is stolen from the gods, right? It's lightning starts on earth and it is harnessed by man. Okay. So all things, without me even getting close to going into all the intricacies of this, these creation stories, these stories told among the Dogon to each other through initiation, explains why they make the drums the way they make them, explains why the houses are made the way that they're made, why their clothes are the way that they are, why the land is cultivated the way they do it, why the human body looks like it does. It explains every part. It explains why certain things happen: death, sacrifice, circumcision. It explains all the signs of the zodiac and how they came to be, and explains intricacies about the solar system and about the constellation Sirius and beyond that ought not be known to them by what is considered Western epistemology. So, in this way, we can interpret this as a giant conflict between twins. I mean, in certain ways, too, this other case that I don't want to move on too quickly about is this case of Amma disappearing after the work of creation. Because it's often the case in old traditions, paganism, so forth, where there is the initial creator, and then they just go away. Like with the Abzu or the forming primordial deities in Sumeria, or what happened to Mehet-Weret after she birthed creation. I think in both the cases of the cow primordial mother in the Nordic tradition and in the Egyptian tradition, they just vanish. So often there is this creator at the beginning, and then they just disappear from the story. They retreat, and we see this with Amma in certain storylines. But he holds all the signs of creation. So at any time, he can destroy this whole thing. At any time. So seemingly, it's all going according to order. And interesting, too, that, this first creation in a version of the story is all centering around a tree. And once the tree has been destroyed, that's when the primordial egg is happening. So the first creation was all about this tree, which, again, Yggdrasil, the tree of life, the tree of knowledge, the wisdom of the druids, the knowers of the oak. Okay. So as we can see with this debate, as this fighting between twins, we saw in Slavic paganism, as it might not be canonical to Slavic paganism, it could be much later because it was just one story that came out of, the hard to trace story of Slavic paganism. But there was the white god and the black god. There were brothers, and they one was seemingly beneficent and the other was a trickster. And everything came to be because of their own feuding. And so in this same case, we're seeing Ogo and Amma. And this isn't the only case too, right? Because what I want to make a point about right now is it seems very interesting to designate what the Dogon traditional beliefs are. So, you might say, well, it's animistic, but there are like very principled deities that very much have a part in it, right? And I'm not saying that other animistic traditions don't have that, but they seem to have a little bit more of an influence. And then you're like, well, then it's paganism, then it's polytheism. And it's like, well, no, because they have like basically three. There's a three with a question mark. And that is, what is is this not antithetical to Christianity is my point. Is this not antithetical to Abrahamic religions is my point. Because you have Amma, the creator. You have Ogo, which can be likened to Satan or Lucifer, or the antagonist, Satanas, literally meaning antagonist. And then God has these kind of things that aren't considered deities for some reason, but they're like lesser deities or lesser divinities that are the hand of God, called angels, or maybe the Nommo. And so what do you call this is my point, you know? Where do you put it in means of category? Because they call it folk tradition, they call it animism, but animism often includes shamanic work. And from what I'm seeing, I'm not seeing a lot of shamanic work aside from ceremonies that take part in releasing the dead from the living world by virtue of a collective ceremony. But these are all just observations I'm making from what I can gather. If anybody has anything to say otherwise, I'm happy to do it. Obviously, I'm very fascinated. Okay. So as mentioned before, mortality was a mistake by virtue of the acts of Ogo, the trickster deity. We also see in certain cases that Coyote, the trickster deity in American native beliefs, is to blame for man's mortality, because they're a trickster. So this arc too, this arc by means the Nommo came to the earth, is also this fodder for extraterrestrial speculation, because it's said, you know, that this arc makes a terrible noise, and it strikes, and it breaks stones, it makes them tremble, and these immense columns of dust which will rise from the sky. And this sounds apocalyptic, like something big's coming. But again, every time I see these things about how it's seemingly extraterrestrial, I'm like, it's a storm. And I don't mean to downplay it. I'm not saying this is what's true. You know, I'm open, sincerely open. But it's like a terrible noise. Okay, that's thunder, that's lightning, immense dust columns. That's a tornado. Like, what? The Nommo coming on an arc? Is an arc also an analogy for potentially a rainbow? So one other thing I wanted to mention, Mamu or Namu of the Sumerians, right? Of the early Sumerian story is the initial primordial goddess that is with Abzu. They are the primordial waters, right? Namu, right? And here we're hearing about a water spirit that takes these serpentine characteristics, right? Namo. And so, is that not very synchronistic? Because Namu, in Sumeria was made into Tiamat, which was the serpent that was slayed by Marduk to inseminate creation. And I know this sounds confusing, but I'm just saying the analogy here is perfect. Not just with Amen, but also with Namu. So this is where I want to take the time to say that perhaps the tradition of the Dogon is a holdover all the way from what gave the stories to the Sumerians. You know, and why we see so many things relating them around the world is because the living tradition that they've held on to predates civilization and is indicative of the stories of which was the seed of all religions. Do you see what I'm saying here? If the names are still so close to what they were said in Sumeria, to Amma and Amen, right? They were around. And so that's why I was poking fun at the speculation that they are the delineation of the Egyptians. By virtue of the history of thought, the Egyptians were the delineation of the beliefs of the Dogon. So let's talk about Sirius, because this is where things get serious. So the Dogon knew that Jupiter has 4 satellites, that Saturn has rings. They knew about how long it takes Venus and Sirius to rotate around the sun. They had 4 calendars, right? For the sun, the moon, for Sirius, and Venus. Very sophisticated. They knew that the moon was a dead planet because it plays into their creation story. And of course, as mentioned before, they knew that the Milky Way was a spiral formation, and they have a story that explains why. And they knew about Sirius B, so we can see Sirius A with the naked eye. And it was speculated in the 1800s that Sirius B existed. Speculated. But it wasn't confirmed until the 1930s. Did I get that right? No. Well, it was first photographed. It wasn't even photographed until 1970, right? So they called Sirius B Emaya before it was found by modern astronomy. And they knew that its star, its companion star, this Sirius B, this Emaya, has a 50-year elliptical orbit. And they also knew that it was extremely heavy and small because it's a dwarf. So, how did they know? And like I mentioned before, they say that the Nommos told them. So what are the Nommos? If they're water spirits, if they are these amphibious beings, what are they? Literal? Immaterial? Because as we've seen throughout different animistic traditions, what could be known by the hypnagogic inner trances is beyond what we call rational by modern epistemology. This is a whole different approach to reality, what we call reality. So I'm not so quick to dismiss and say that these are physical beings that come down from the sky. This is something beyond that. Stranger to the modern mind than that. So knowing about the planets in the our planets in the solar system, knowing about the constellations, right? So this led to a lot of fervor in trying to explain how they would know, and that's to say that these anthropologists, these ethnographers, must have maybe accidentally told them, or they must have been in contact with a civilization that knew this, which is an interesting thing. Because if they were in contact with a civilization that knew these things, how did those civilizations know those things? It doesn't add up, is what I'm saying. Like when they say, okay, so they must have learned it from the ethnographers. Well, they have clay tablets or depictions of Sirius B that are from like more than hundreds of years ago. And they still say that there's a Sirius C, but they also say it's an imperceptible star, and that has yet to be found, which is a very curious thing. They say that's where the home planet of the Nommos are, which is very, very curious. And there has been a recent study in France, I don't know how recent, I'm missing it in my notes right now, that has found some sort of mathematical or working out greater than just theoretical existence of the potential for a Sirius C. So, what do we got to say here? The knowledge of the greater solar system, the density of stars, the rings of Saturn, the orbits, how long they take. If this knowledge was inherited by other civilizations as they've carried things through time, it doesn't explain anything about how those civilizations came to know these things. By all that we understand, I don't like the way I'm putting this, by what we consider realistic, by what we consider advanced in modern technology, this doesn't add up. It's not the first time. The more we look into history over and over and over and over again, the trickster rears its head, right? Making us have to recontextualize our cute little story. So how they come to know, I don't, I think it's really silly to see these ways that these critics have attempted to dismantle the legitimacy of them simply knowing these things. There has been over and over again throughout the course, we've seen that what have been in the past referred to as primitive traditions know wholesale more than how they were treated, right? And so over and over again, when I say it challenges our epistemology, what I mean is it challenges the very foundations of what this culture that has taken over the world, this modern culture, declares as knowledge, means of acquiring knowledge. And so the Dogon here represents something very fascinating in more ways than one. The retention of things that have always been known since before civilization, as I would speculate and trace personally. Obviously, Sirius has been known by mythology. It's in the mythos of the Greeks. It's in the mythos of the Egyptians causing the first floods of the Nile. It's obvious that it's been known. But the descriptness within these stories, the descriptness of the astronomy, the descriptness of what their beliefs say about all cultures around the world, right? How it's connected is truly fascinating. So with that said, I think I had to call it there.